So the question is there purpose in nature?
And no, there are functions, but purpose is loaded with teleological claims that I don't accept.
I don't accept them, slurpy slurpy.
Are you crazy? Is that your problem?
Welcome back everyone to Bridge the Divide, where I examine irrational beliefs, the irrational behaviors that often follow, and how we, with education, rationality, and reason, can bridge the societal divides that they create. Today, we're going to kick off 2025 by taking a look at the latest entry in JimBob's Arguments Against Atheism series, in which everyone's favorite Fire Festival Aftermath personification makes the interesting claim that atheists, like theists, also believe in miracles. Now, before we dive into this, I feel I need to establish one major point, a point that I'm sure many of you have already hit upon. Appealing to miracles alone is not a defeater for atheism, and there's two reasons for this. First, and most obviously, because atheism is a self-identifier concerned with one single proposition, the existence of a god or gods, thus it says nothing about miracles. And second, just because someone may use the term miracle to describe a particular phenomenon does not entail that that individual also believes in the existence of a god or gods, because that entailment would be entirely dependent upon how that individual is defining what a miracle is. It's kind of like the reverse of naturalistic theism, in which a person believes that a god exists and interacts directly with the universe, but holds that those interactions are completely naturalistic in nature. All that being said, what this point ultimately tells us is that JimBob's video is really just another straw man.
Well, I guess we're done here.
But despite that point, I do have to concede that while the probability is extraordinarily low, it is within the realm of possibility that JimBob could very well be the first person to find some form of logical consistency here. Maybe he has refuted atheism by being able to demonstrate that his God exists independent of mind and context without begging the question. Maybe he's made the ultimate scientific breakthrough that demonstrates that the only logically possible mechanism behind the existence of this universe is an agent with that specific intent, and we should be getting his Nobel ready. Then again, maybe he's identified the mind-independent source for what the definition of what a miracle is that everyone must necessarily adhere to.
Somehow I doubt that.
Then again, he could simply just be arguing that his various positions are true simply because they are logically entailed to be so if the specific God that he presupposes to exist actually does exist. So even though the very title of his video demonstrates that whatever argument he is about to make is logically fallacious, for the sheer entertainment value, and of course acknowledging the very desperate and obvious Morton's fork he created by tagging me personally in the video, I'm going to dissect his reasoning to see exactly how he concludes that a person with a non-theistic worldview somehow simultaneously justifies adhering to a purely theological concept. Let's dive in.
You know how atheists say, I see no evidence for miracles? Well, I wonder if this is true under their view.
So this question is actually a bit tricky, and that's because the term miracle, much like the term prophecy, is deeply problematic, given that the standard for classifying any one particular phenomenon as being miraculous is entirely subjective. So to really answer the question, I would first need you, JimBob, to clarify what you think a miracle actually is, and then we can parse things out from there. And technically, he could go one of two ways here. He could appeal strictly to the etymology of the word miracle, a Middle English word which via Old French is from the Latin miraculum, meaning object of wonder, mirare meaning to wonder, and mirus meaning wonderful. And if he takes that route, he's essentially just defining a miracle as any one particular phenomenon that happens to inspire the emotional state of wonder, or the combination of surprise and admiration, in the observer. Or he could take the second option and appeal to the generally accepted contextual definition of the word, which would make it explicitly theological in nature. But seeing as how JimBob identifies himself as a theist, and he has made this video specifically to be an argument against atheism, I think that we can reasonably conclude from there that he's going to be speaking strictly from the theological position. Now, that all being said, I will go ahead and answer that question from my position, which is that I hold the term miracle in the theological category, much like the God category itself, to be completely incoherent. And that is because there is no mind-independent referent for what a miracle necessarily is in all cases. Which basically means that I hold the term to be nothing more than a label that is subjectively slapped onto any given phenomenon that a theist cannot readily explain and immediately interprets to be beneficial to themselves. The miracle, just like the God itself, is defined only by that which the claimant is subjectively putting into that category.
Is it possible that atheists believe in miracles without even realizing it? Let's find out.
Once again, that depends entirely on what definition of a miracle you're operating with, and if the atheist agrees with that definition. So let's hear your definition of a miracle, Jim Bob, and see how exactly you defend it.
What is a miracle under the atheist view? I've defined it as the following. A miracle is an event or phenomenon that cannot be explained by the laws of physics.
Okay, so huge issues here. This entire thing is supposed to be an argument against atheism, which is predicated upon the notion that atheists also believe in miracles, which would imply that your definition of what a miracle is, Jim Bob, would at minimum be theological in nature. But the definition you've chosen to provide here is actually pretty vague. For one, you've completely stripped out any theological context from the term, the context that would make a miracle any phenomenon that is beyond the laws of nature, and whose explanation can only be attributed to a supernatural being. And in removing that context, all you're essentially doing is defining a miracle as a phenomenon that a person cannot readily explain by their personal understanding of the laws of physics. Because obviously, just because a person doesn't possess an explanation by way of the laws of physics, it is not logically entailed that an explanation by way of the laws of physics doesn't exist. Which, by the way you've worded it, is exactly what your first premise is implying. Now, I suspect that you've worded it in that way to imply that atheists as a whole are just being intellectually dishonest, because in your mind that we, by virtue of being an atheist, do believe in a phenomenon that matches your particular definition of what a miracle is, and we just refuse to acknowledge it because we don't like the theological context of the word. But if your video is supposed to be an argument against atheism, which technically would mean it's an argument for theism, then why exactly would you choose to use a definition that is completely stripped of the theological context that you're ostensibly supposed to be arguing the justification for? It seems to me that there might be an underlying assumption here that you have yet to address.
This is not referring to an event we have not yet explained by the laws of physics. It's an event or phenomenon that definitionally cannot be explained by the laws of physics.
So I first have to tackle something odd you've done here, Jim Bob. While scientific domains such as biology, ecology, geology, psychology, and many others ultimately operate within the physical constraints of the laws of physics, you presenting the laws of physics as though they are the only way that any phenomenon can actually be explained is just intellectual dishonesty. Yes, the domain of physics does provide a foundational understanding of matter and energy, but there are additional principles and frameworks beyond the basic laws of physics that we use to explain various phenomena within various scientific domains. So we don't have to appeal solely to the laws of physics to explain every single phenomenon we happen to observe. It also sounds very much like you're flitting around the positive claim that there are phenomena that we humans are currently aware of that we know are impossible to explain solely by the laws of physics. And I'm really curious to see how you're justifying that conclusion. We may in fact be getting closer to that underlying assumption I think you're making.
Let's make that definition premise 1. Given the definition in premise 1, is there anything under the atheist view that cannot be explained by the laws of physics?
Sure, there are a few things that cannot fully be explained by our current understanding of the laws of physics. These include things like the nature of dark matter, dark energy, quantum gravity, cosmic inflation, and matter-antimatter asymmetry. But we obviously don't slap the label of miracle on these things. We simply acknowledge with intellectual honesty that our current understanding of the laws of physics either needs to be refined or further expanded, either of which will naturally occur in the light of new evidence. But ultimately, given our current understanding of the laws of physics, it's generally accepted in that domain that nothing should fundamentally violate those laws. Still, this would not be a justification for asserting a theological term as an answer, because that would just be begging the question.
Is there anything we can point to that can't be explained by the laws of physics? What about the existence of the laws of physics themselves?
Well, that depends on one major distinction, and that is if you hold that the laws of physics are either descriptive or prescriptive of the universe. In the domain of physics, the laws of physics are held as being descriptive, meaning that they describe how the universe operates based upon observations, and they are not held as being prescriptive, meaning that the universe behaves the way it does because it should behave that way. The whole reason that the domain of physics holds that those laws are descriptive in nature is because to assert that the laws of physics are prescriptive in nature is to assume that the universe operates the way it does because it is intended to operate that way, which in the theist mind means specifically for humans, which in turn assumes the existence of an agent with that intention in mind. I wonder which one you're gonna hold to, Jim Bob.
Can the laws of physics and the regularity of nature explain their own existence? I don't think so.
Like I said, if you are holding that these things are prescriptive in nature, then no, obviously they can't. But if they are held as being descriptive, then they don't need to be. So it seems to me, JimBob, that you are invoking your own presuppositional standard regarding the laws of physics, and then applying it to your syllogism as though everyone already agrees with you. So my question here is, why haven't you actually stated what that standard is?
So we found something under the atheist view that can't be explained by the laws of physics. The laws of physics and regularity of nature cannot explain their own existence.
So yeah, JimBob, because you're assuming a position that is not logically entailed by being an atheist, and you're assuming a philosophical stance on physics which is not held by the domain of physics itself, this is just a complete misrepresentation. Ultimately, you're presenting aspects of your own worldview, aspects, by the way, which are entirely predicated upon the existence of your specific God, as though they are also being held by the atheist as being necessarily true, just without the God concept to back them up. Essentially, you're just creating a problem where none exists.
We're going to add that as premise 2. So let's take a look at our argument so far. Premise 1. A miracle is an event or phenomenon that cannot be explained by the laws of physics.
A premise I reject, by the way, because I do not hold to that proprietary definition of what a miracle is. But for the sake of logical validity, let's see where he goes with this.
Premise 2. The laws of physics and the regularity of nature cannot explain their existence.
Now, I have to point out that it is very interesting that you threw in the regularity of nature in your second premise, because in doing so, you've subtly copped to that underlying assumption that I suspected was there from the beginning. In philosophy, there are two competing theories regarding the laws of nature, and I want to make this very clear for the audience, JimBob. You haven't yet specified which one of these you're adhering to as the underlying assumption for your syllogism. Now, on one hand, you have regularity theory, which is a philosophical perspective that holds that the laws of nature are merely descriptions of the perceived uniformities in the world. This, by the way, is the perspective that I hold to. But on the other hand, you have necessitarian theory, which is the philosophical perspective that holds that the laws of nature are principles that govern the operation of the world, or in a much simpler sense, that the natural world obeys the laws of nature. Now, philosophically speaking, depending upon which position you take, there are a number of things that are either accepted or dropped, such as the concept of free will. But ultimately, when you boil these two concepts down, you get to one fundamental starting point, and that is whether or not you think that the existence of human beings is intentional, thus making us inherently special in the universe. Which means that at its core, the necessitarian position does beg the question of the existence of an agent with the intent to actualize the parameters that are specifically necessary for humans to exist and reason to the conclusion that such an agent exists. This actually happens to be one of the first major roadblocks that I ran into in my deconversion journey. The arrogance and hubris required to hold, even to the detriment of all other species on the planet, that our lone species is just that special. So this is also a premise that I reject, JimBob, because I do not hold that the laws of physics are prescriptive, because I do not hold to your underlying assumption of necessitarianism.
Conclusion. The existence of the laws of physics and regularity in nature is a miracle under the atheist view.
So, syllogistically, the argument is valid. Without diving headlong into any implied or assumed context, the conclusion does follow from the premises. Unfortunately for you, JimBob, a logically valid argument alone is not evidence for anything. Essentially, all you've done here is present a logically valid argument that is ultimately predicated upon a number of assumptions that you hold to about things in the universe that you cannot demonstrate to actually be the case. Which basically means that your entire syllogism is a literal nothing burger.
Now, what are the responses we can expect from the atheists?
Well, I've given a few of them here. That your definition of miracle is proprietary, and that your implication regarding the nature of the laws of physics is a result of your underlying assumption of necessitarianism, which at its core is begging the question.
One might be, well, just because we haven't yet explained how we have those laws doesn't mean we won't eventually discover an answer. Duh.
True, that goes back to what I originally pointed out, that it seems that you're implying that we humans are currently aware of a variety of phenomenon that can never be explained by the laws of physics. Which, of course, is something that you yourself cannot defend, because even if all of us humans went extinct before we ever found an explanation, would not logically entail that a laws of physics explanation for these phenomena does not exist.
Well, the reason this isn't a valid counter to the argument is because any causal chain you posit would be bound by the same laws.
And that is an irrelevant rebuttal because we are not assuming anything beyond our current understanding. Certainly, if nothing can fundamentally violate the laws of physics, then every phenomena can eventually be explained by the laws of physics or by its domain's relation to the laws of physics. This isn't controversial or even problematic, primarily because even if we don't yet have an explanation by way of the laws of physics, it doesn't entail that such an explanation doesn't exist, and we're not assuming the existence of anything beyond the laws of physics that would be necessary to explain any given phenomena. The end result is simply that we don't currently know, and while we may know in the future, it's entirely possible that we may never know. That's just intellectual honesty.
To say a previous set of laws of physics produced the current laws of physics is to assume a process that adheres to the laws of physics, which is also producing those laws while abiding by them.
And we're back to you assuming that the laws of physics are prescriptive rather than descriptive. You're still trying to force the atheist to argue as though certain aspects of your worldview are necessarily true, when you yourself cannot demonstrate them to be necessarily true without begging the question.
Another counter could be, I reject your definition of a miracle.
Yeah, pretty much called that one. Given that the definition of miracle you're using here, JimBob, is completely stripped of its theological context, which would essentially mean there's no reason to use the term at all.
Well, this could be a fair counter depending on the reasoning.
Now, that can be seen from two perspectives. The first being that it's a disingenuous use of the term because you are deliberately ignoring the agreed-upon theological context of the term, but in response, you just appeal to the polysemous nature of words and call that an argument from popularity. The second, however, is the incoherency of the term in the context of the non-theistic worldview. In that context, the specific determination for what a miracle is entirely up to the claimant. Is it a phenomenon that has been demonstrated to violate natural law and thus can only be possible if a supernatural entity exists? Is it a phenomenon that is simply extremely rare? Is it a phenomenon that is not only extremely rare, but also somehow benefits the claimant in some personal way? What if it's a phenomenon that is extremely rare, but also hurts and hinders the claimant, but is somehow beneficial to someone else? And what frame of reference are we appealing to in either scenario? And by what mechanism are we eliminating confirmation bias from how the definition is being determined? This, JimBob, is precisely why you invoking a theological term in a non-theological context is extremely problematic.
However, any argument against biblical miracles would have to appeal to the suspension or violation of the known laws of physics. I could be wrong here, but I don't see any way a naturalist could reject the premises.
You are wrong here, and that is demonstrated by the fact that you keep arguing from the position that the laws of physics are prescriptive in nature, which I suspect is precisely why you have conspicuously chosen not to address that distinction or your underlying assumption of necessitarianism.
And if they accept the premises, the conclusion that follows is that they do in fact believe in one miracle.
Exactly, if they accept the premises, which would mean that they are holding to your proprietary definition of what a miracle is, and that they hold that the laws of physics are the only way to possibly explain any given phenomena, because they themselves already hold to necessitarianism and view the laws of physics as being prescriptive in nature. Which again is why the syllogism that you presented here doesn't actually prove your argument against atheism true, because even if you happen to find a handful of atheists that actually agree with all of your assertions and assumptions, that wouldn't be a defeater for atheism because it wouldn't actually demonstrate or even logically entail that any version of a god actually exists, let alone your version of that god just because you happen to define it as the thing that does the thing that you think is being done. And it would be a fallacy of composition if you then asserted that what was true of that handful of atheists was true for all atheists.
The irony here is that the one miracle which the atheist accepts is the standard by which they reject all other miracles.
And at this point, I don't think I have to repeat my explanations. Suffice to say, JimBob, that the problem only exists because you yourself have deliberately created the circumstances that led to its existence. Much like how in your own worldview, the logical possibility of evil actions and outcomes only exist because your God deliberately created the circumstances that allow for their existence.
His basis for rejecting miracles is itself a miracle under his own view.
So once again, JimBob simply creates a problem out of thin air and then presents it as something that all atheists must contend with, just so long as they don't come to realize that what he's essentially asking for here is a non-theistic defense of various positions held in his theistic worldview. It's the same narcissistic crap that theist chuds like Darth Dawkins do, just with less philosophical word salad. But despite all that, I still think that there is a way to bridge the divide here, even with someone whose approach is consistently in bad faith. It's important to understand and remember that when the foundational concepts that undergird any particular worldview are different, then the logical entailments of those foundational concepts are also going to be different. If one worldview contains a God concept that is defined as providing the grounding for certain claims and entailments, that does not imply that those same claims and entailments exist in any other worldview. And just because one person may disagree or dislike what is logically entailed in another person's worldview, does not logically entail that their own worldview is the correct one of the two. One thing that JimBob's video here does is stress for the audience the importance of the principle of parsimony known as Grice's razor, which states that conversational implicature is the preferred linguistic explanation over semantic context dependence. Essentially, it's better to focus on what the speaker actually means instead of the literal meaning of what they've said. In the example of JimBob's video, quibbling about what the specific definition of what a miracle is far less important than recognizing and understanding that his entire syllogism is predicated upon his underlying assumption of necessitarianism, which again I think is precisely why he chose to never address that extremely important distinction. We have to remember that if we start from the assumption that certain aspects of our own worldview are automatically held as true in the other person's worldview, then we run the risk of hindering the exchange of ideas and further reinforcing the division between understanding. In the end, while all of our individual worldviews may possess different starting axioms, that doesn't mean that any one of those worldviews is necessarily logically inconsistent as a whole, and it's only through acknowledging and working with intellectual honesty within that scope that we will finally be able to stop focusing on one another and start focusing on the problems that we collectively face, instead of wasting our time and energy fabricating them out of whole cloth just so we can try and win a debate. A debate which, frankly, in JimBob's case here, he's the only one participating in. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please like, share, and subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications. And be sure to leave a comment below. I love reading your responses, and those interactions help with the dreaded algorithm. Don't forget, January is Poverty Awareness Month. A link to where you can support these important efforts is down in the description. And if you like what you saw here and would like to support this channel further, links for channel membership and to get yourself some official Bridge the Divide gear are also in the description. Once again, a massive thank you to each and every single one of you. I hope you have an amazing new year, and as always, be safe, be excellent to each other, and together, we can bridge the divide.